Morning.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing all right. I saw your talk. It was good.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, kind of had like unfortunate timing as far as like it was like immediately after Steven's talk, which like covered
There's some
like a lot of the
overlap.
same. So like I mean, it would have been better. I would have felt more comfortable if it was like the day before, and
Yeah, or maybe on like they had different tracks, right?
yeah, right,
Two different tracks. Yeah, there
yeah,
was there was a little bit of overlap. It was kind of coming at stuff from different directions though.
yeah. Mine certainly it was like a lot more of how do we how do you fix it
Yeah.
was also part of the approach there.
Like practically what do you do now? And Stevens was the future.
Right, right.
I'm gonna fill up my water bottle while people filter it. Is Calvin coming to this thing, or you said it was his birthday?
I'm sorry.
Uh,
It's Martin's birthday.
oh yes, 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 yes.
Yes. Hey,
How was GraphQL Conf? You were there, right?
I thought it was pretty great. Yeah, it was really fun.
It looked
It
really
was
well
amazing.
organized.
I really
Yep.
enjoyed it. It was brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. No, it wasn't last year that I don't know. The last one I was at was like a side room at another conference. So this was a pretty huge step up from that.
Yeah, that was just last year. Yeah,
Gosh,
so
time.
this was the first like standalone conference for the GraphQL Foundation. So it's also just significant in that way.
Yeah,
And
pretty huge.
and it was like just under 400 people. So it was I don't know, I felt like it was a nice size, like a little bit more intimate than like GraphQL Summit and
Mhm.
and a lot of basically all the important people besides Alex Riley.
Yeah, it looked great. If Calvin comes, I'll let him take over, but I can start, I guess. Agenda. Everybody has agreed to the membership agreement, I think. I think we're good there. Quick. Do we need to do a round of introductions? I guess for the recording, maybe? I don't know. What do you
Yeah, we
usually do,
should for
Benji?
YouTube. Yeah.
Okay. I'll start off. I'm Alex. I'm here independently, and I've been working on client control nullability for a minute now. Next up on the list is Stephen.
Hey, I'm Steven. I work at Netflix, and yeah.
Calvin's not here. Young.
Hi, my name is Young, and I am at the trade desk.
Ernie.
Yeah, so I'm Ernie. I'm working at Coinbase, and just kind of just getting started into all the working group side of things as far as GraphQL is concerned. So
Benoit.
Hey, I'm Benoit from Apollo. I work on Apollo Kotlin.
And last but
And hi,
certainly not
everyone.
least.
I'm Benji.
I can try to take some notes here. What's next? I'll try to take some notes. The agenda, the only thing on the agenda is to discuss non-nullable error boundaries, the previous meeting's action items. Let me check on those. I don't think we wrote any down, or maybe they're
I
in the
think
notes.
at least the one that I remember is just to update the spec per your feedback, and I did that earlier this week. I'm not sure if you've seen that. I maybe should have pinged you.
I did see it. I owe you a review.
Okay, cool.
But it looks pretty good. Cool. Yeah, I guess Benji, you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do, we have an open item to add the CCN update to the next working group meeting agenda, which I believe we've done, and we can close that out now. So
All right.
I'll go ahead and do that. And that was issue number 14. And did we already strip down the proposal to just the bang? Is that what you were mentioning just now?
Yes.
So I think we can close that as well, even if it's not like, fully done or whatever. The fact is the action has been taken, so we can close that, which means we've got no active action items. Fantastic. Well done, everyone. Okay, let's get on to the main subject. So you asked about the conference. Conference was brilliant. So amazing to just spend so much time talking to so many amazing and intelligent people that know so much about GraphQL and all the different ways it's being used. There were many discussions that covered client-controlled nullability throughout the 3 days and somewhat around them as well. After Stephen's amazing talk, which I recommend that you all go and see, especially about the nothing sandwiches, delicious. I recommend something in that talk. It was actually just one single pink question mark on a slide by its own, just sparked a little thing in my brain. And I went and had a chat with Stephen and Jordan afterwards. And then I ran off and I got my laptop and I started coding. So what I have tried to do is I've written an RFC that addresses partially, it's very hacked out during the middle of a conference RFC, but essentially it pulls together a few of the ideas that we've been kicking around. So one of them was the interrobang operator that we were talking about at one point, but we were thinking about it from the client side of things, and this moves it to be a server side of things. And broadly, it builds upon Jordan's opinion that the real problem, the real reason that we need client-controlled nullability is because in GraphQL, everything is nullable by default, and we have no way to indicate what the, let's say, the true nullability of something is. So, for example, if you've got a post in a forum, that post in your data model might always have an author. But at the moment, we have to make it so that that is nullable in case when we fetch the author, there's an error. So that error isn't actually saying that there is no author. What it's saying is we couldn't fetch the author, which is a different thing. And at the moment in GraphQL, we compound these two things. It could error and I want that error to stop here. And it can be null and that's a legitimate value for it. These two things are merged together. And what Jordan was proposing is that we try and separate these. And we were discussing ways that we might go about doing this, and we didn't manage to come up with any that didn't mean just having like two schemas or doing some interesting shenanigans. On the interesting shenanigans front, what my RFC effectively proposes is a variant of the non-null type. That means it's not meant to be null, but it can be null, but only if there's an error. So I'm thinking of it as a non-nullable error boundary. So if an error happens, the error will stop here and it will be replaced with a null, but there will only be a null in this position if there is a matching error in the errors array. Something essentially like that. So at the moment, what is written up in the RFC is that this is a variant of the non-null type. So non-null represented with a bang, the variant represented with a bang and a question mark. But you could also think of it as another wrapper type. So we currently have two wrapper types in GraphQL. One is non-null and the other one is list. So it could be that we add a third one called error boundary, in which case you would have a int that is non-null and then is an error boundary, which again would be int, bang for non-null, and then question mark for error boundary. That said, interrobang is not the most beautiful of symbols. So the syntax is actually very much a thing that we can bike shed over and come up with a better approach for. The way that I see it is that these things kind of live on a scale. So you've got nullable and error boundary, which is like the far left-hand side. Then you've got the far right-hand side, which is non-nullable that we currently have. And I'm effectively introducing a type in the middle, which is non-nullable error boundary. Now, originally, if we were starting again from scratch, we might have made it so the left was a question mark, the middle's nothing, and the right is an exclamation mark. But that ship has sailed. The left-hand side is already a nothing, and the right-hand side is already an exclamation mark. So we need some symbol for the middle. And at the moment, I'm proposing the interrobang. I would love to have better options. But in general, I guess the question is this. If we were to come up with a solution, maybe like this interrobang, maybe something else, that was to truly represent what the expected nullability is of a field, then would we actually need client-controlled nullability anymore in terms of like issuing question marks and exclamation points? Now, obviously, you could still use it if it were to exist, but the question is it sufficiently strong a need that we would actually need to add it? Because as you all know, it adds significant complexities, particularly when it comes to like fragment merging and needing to make sure that those symbols match up even when the fragments themselves may be defined in separate areas of the code and various other things like that. And I find myself personally agreeing with Jordan's opinion, which is basically if we had better indication of the nullability in the schema, the true nullability as Jordan calls it, then we probably wouldn't need the client-controlled nullability at all. One last thing before I hand over to discussion. Separately from all of this is the need to not bubble errors. And that is a separate concern. It may overlap. It might be that we use the same solution for everything. So for example, you could turn off bubbling of errors by just putting a question mark on every single field and every single list item throughout the entire query that you issue. This is required for gateways. It's required for gateways because you need to be able to know what the underlying fields are so that you can implement your own non-nullability. And it's also required by clients like Relay that want to be able to safely write to their normalized stores. Because at the moment, it's unsafe to do so if there's an error in the response, because it might blow up things that actually shouldn't have been blown up. It's just because something deeper down has failed. So we are potentially proposing that that particular specific concern might be dealt with in a separate way by, for example, on the operation adding a, what was it, Stephen? No bubbles, please, directive or something like that. So those are the two things, interrobang and no bubbles, please. Any thoughts?
sorry. I think we talked a little bit about in the context of how CCM makes sense in the world of true nullability. And I think the thing that I said at that time was it's all about the timing. Like it took 2 years for CCN to get to a place where like, okay, well, let's just merge in the smallest thing that we can. And with the new RFC, I am hesitant to wait for another 2 years to see something in. And it depends on the timing. And I think, honestly speaking, I think the people leading the kind of CCN effort, like I especially just dropped out for the past like 2 years, and that is like a big reason why CCN hasn't progressed as much as maybe could have. But that calendar time issue, I think, um, is like on top of my mind. Like, yes, there's an ideal solution that we can get to. And I agree with you that I think if we have like interbank or like nullability, then like the use case, the usefulness of CCN decreases significantly. But it's not there. Like we are not there yet. So I think that gives me a pause when we say, okay, CCN, let's pause CCN for the better, for the kind of simpler future.
Yeah, going on that thread. Yeah, that's definitely a an important concern. And that was driving like me at least earlier this summer, wanting to kind of trim back the CCN proposal to kind of its simplest form, so that we could at least get something in, kind of make incremental steps. And I think that that can be a good approach, to take incremental steps, as long as those incremental steps are are leading where we want to go. And that's where I am having some doubts now. Now that we're kind of seeing a potential of these kind of larger changes that would be challenging, would take us some time to get them in. But the concern that I have is it possible that introducing even the kind of minimal version of CCN, would that be kind of handing clients a potential like gun that they could point at their foot to like force the bubbling that is not would be not just like no longer needed potentially, but like actively harmful eventually. And then looking at the kind of the broad picture of GraphQL, would we end up in a place where we have this feature that is like now considered not good practice to use anymore? And then especially if we're talking about adding syntax to do this, and adding syntax is it's not something to be taken lightly, since there's a lot of open source tools out there now. So one proposal I was thinking is taking CCN back to being a directive, and a directive that's just implemented client side. Maybe making this like an RFC, maybe even like stage 2 or something, implemented in major clients like Apollo, so that it is something that people can use to solve a problem, but maybe not getting it as far as like actually merged into the spec. But like being an RFC kind of gives it a solid enough definition that we could have consistent handling across different clients, and also in like CodeGen, because like having this work with CodeGen is practically speaking a useful thing. But yeah, if it's not syntax, as Benoit mentioned, it's can't specify lists. It's it's going to have some limitations.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just like the smart client, dumb client limitation there, right? Of like directives. Like if you're curling stuff, it's like directives are not, nothing there. I mean, I think like I don't know how much of like how important it is, but I think the one part that that we maybe like would lose if we didn't actually push forward with CCN is basically like use cases where you don't own the schema, and it's like I want to modify the behavior or something, but I like whatever schema is out there hasn't implemented like true schema nullability yet or whatever. Like I say, it's all still like fully nullable, and it's like I want to modify that behavior, right? And I think that's like you would lose that, which I don't know if that's enough of a justification to push forward with like a change in how we would how like the actual implementation would work under the hood, right? But I think it's like worth calling out that there are a couple places that like don't necessarily get solved by this new like by changing tact here, I guess.
So one of the great things about the exclamation mark modifier, the bang modifier, is that it doesn't require server support. We've got all the information that we need from the server without sending the exclamation point to the server in order to reproduce that behavior locally. And to your point, Ernie, putting a bang in your GraphQL query and putting a bang in your TypeScript code aren't that far different, right? If the thing that you do violates something, you're going to throw an error. The advantage of doing it in your client code, particularly in something like React, for example, is you might be able to capture it at an error boundary, and it would be local to that fragment and that use case, which is one of the big issues that actually adding it as syntax to the query, to the request, as I should say, doesn't actually give you. And then you've got all the issues with potentially conflicting when you do it through the GraphQL network. But if you just do it in your components, it's not going to give those same issues. So I think generally the argument that I heard at the conference that was most convincing is this is putting the bang in there is a dangerous thing to do. It's going to blow things up. You can already do that in your own code. Do it in your own code and you've got better control over it. And I find that quite a compelling argument. The question mark, on the other hand, is something that would require server support. But at the moment, we're talking about scoping that out anyway. So I very much agree with Stephen's point, which is, I mean, to put it in different words, the GraphQL is going to be here for a long time. Let's not just add something to get us through the next couple of years. Let's build to where it should be. And ideally, we shouldn't have this spec as an ever-growing thing that we just keep adding hundreds of features to. Otherwise, we'll get to the state where web browsers are right now, where it's basically impossible to build a new web browser. You have to use one of the existing ones because the specs for it are just so incredibly large. So yeah, I'm keen that we figure out what it is that we want to build and we build that. That said, to your point, Young, the issue of time, this latest proposal, which admittedly was only come up with last week, isn't particularly complicated. It is a little subtle. For example, it talks about collecting errors, which isn't a concept that exists currently. You only currently raise or throw, I forget which word we use, an error. So we would need to add extra words around that. And there are things about like, do we put it into the main errors array, or is there a companion one that we've discussed years ago that may come up again? But it may not be too hard if we can all align on this to actually implement it. Alex.
I didn't quite follow what you were talking about. The exclamation point not needing server support. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have an exclamation point and you send that through, then you're saying that this field that was nullable should not be nullable. And so what you are asking for is to the server, if a null happens here, then instead of just having it be null, throw an error and bubble it up. Now, your client, assuming that it knows what the GraphQL query is, will, and the schema, let's say, would be able to apply that same logic. So you could do it locally and you could have it bubble up to the next non-nullable on the client side at render time, rather than doing it on the server side. And that also means that other reads from that store won't have to be affected by whatever non-nullability thing that you have there. So effectively, I'm saying you can put an exclamation point in your TypeScript code and have a similar effect. It won't be the same effect, but a similar effect. You could also, if you wanted to be relay, for example, you could also absolutely fully replicate the behavior that would have been there had you have put an exclamation point. Because relay understands the query, relay understands your schema, and it knows where that would have bubbled to, and it knows which thing would have been blown up, and it can just simulate it. We don't actually need the server to know anything about this for this to happen. And in fact, relay already do that, right, with their directives.
Thanks, it's helpful.
So Benji, if we dig into your proposal kind of a little bit and like a little more depth there, right? I think the question that kind of came up, which you did a great job of like synthesizing it down into like a couple of paragraphs of describing kind of what the deal is I'm kind of curious, and you mentioned they were like separate proposals as far as like the, interrogating operator style plus like the no bubbling, like execution time sort of flag or something like that, right? I think the question is sort of like, how are those at odds with each other? As far as if I say that, I want this thing, like if something below this level is an error, I want it to bubble up to this level and then no further, right? And so I think the question is like, okay, well, but if I turn on this other runtime flag, this is like, don't bubble at all, that doesn't happen anymore, correct? Is that like, I just want to make sure I understand kind of the two things there.
So I'm not sure I fully understand who the I is when you were describing that. Is it I, the schema designer, or I, the person making the request? But before you expand, just to make it clear, the interrobang and no bubbles please would work perfectly fine together. Interrobang is a way of indicating via introspection, via the SDL or whatever it is that you work with, what the kind of true nullability of a field is. And no bubbles please is just turning off null bubbling. So they don't conflict with each other. They would complement each other perfectly, I think.
Okay. So, but I mean, yeah, I see. I can see how they would complement each other. I think it's just that the behavior obviously like changes and shifts when you like when you say like turn off no bubbling, right? Because like previously it would go all the way up to your error boundary, and now it won't anymore in that subsequent, for that subsequent request, right? Because I think the question is just like, are there use cases where someone has a field in their schema? I guess the question is like, if I was approaching this, like say all this stuff exists today, right? If I was designing a schema, I would probably go through and like put the interrobang on like everything. And so like I think the kind of approach is like, what are the use cases where you actually don't want to do that, and you would only selectively place it in certain situations? Because I think there's kind of this attitude of like, if there was an error somewhere, that's totally fine to know about that field. Like I don't need to like have this sort of like conditional, like the schema designer control the no bubbling. It's kind of more of a I just wonder what the use cases were, like putting that selectively as opposed to just kind of like spamming it across the entire schema, which I think was, part of this stuff brought up of just the syntax of, trying to read a schema where it's exclamation point, question mark, like everywhere, right? And kind of like being confused about why is this everywhere, right? So have you thought kind of like obviously I'm sure, yeah, like kind of what are the use cases of like why you wouldn't take that approach of just like putting it on every field?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely great question. So as Matt Mahoney said when we discussed this at the conference, defaults matter. Ideally, this new thing would be no symbol. And what we have as currently the nullable would be a question mark, right? This thing may not exist. It's an or null. effectively, right? Null is a legitimate value for this thing. A post may have an author, or it might not have an author because that person's been deleted, let's say. So ideally, we'd be in that situation where this middle behavior that I'm proposing as the interrobang would actually be no symbol. This is the default. And then if you want to say null is allowed, you go question mark. And if you want to say I don't even want a null here, even if there's an error, then you go with the bang, for example. But as I mentioned earlier, like the ship has sailed on that kind of. We could potentially do something like that. It would be, I think, more work, and it would be a kind of a case of like when your client introspects the schema, if the schema has this particular property, then no symbol now means this new thing, and question mark now means, and you'd effectively have two versions triggered by, you know, a directive on the schema or some other subtle thing. But my proposal is currently simpler than that. But I 100% agree with you that you would just want to put interrobang on almost every field. Like, yeah, username, that's never going to be null. Avatar probably will be null, so that might want a question mark, you know. At the moment, it would just stay blank. So most things, I think, would want to be interrobanged. And to answer the question about the no bubbles, effectively what the no bubbles directive would be saying is treat every non-null as if it were a non-null error boundary. So turn every bang into an interrobang automatically. I think, anyway. Alex again.
Is there any way they go for a change in defaults? Like how breaking can major version bumps be? I don't know. Benji, you've been at a lot of these meetings. You have a feel for that?
Changing the default in the GraphQL spec, I think, would be an incredibly big thing to do. But changing what the default is in your library of choice that you use to build a GraphQL schema, probably not GraphQL.js, but maybe Pothos, for example, that you use to build your schemas, or whatever framework you use for building your schemas on top of the implementation. I think that is very much open for people to do. But my main concern is putting interrobang in every position in your schema is going to be just a sea of symbols, and it seems really unpleasant. And I'd rather come up with a better solution, but I don't know what that is yet. It might be that we just simplify it to one particular symbol, like $, ampersand, hash, not hash, that's a comment, but you know, some other symbol might be the right thing to do here, but I don't know what that one would be. Ideas welcome. Stephen.
I mean, you know, since we are, you know, like you said, Benji, you know, thinking of GraphQL as something that is, you know, a long-term thing, and you know, we're thinking about the net simplicity of the resulting GraphQL, you know, 5-10 years from now. Yeah, I think it is worth you know, exploring like what is, you know, what is our ideal state, you know, if just hypothetically this could be greenfield, you know, what would that look like? And then maybe we will find a, you know, a creative solution to handle the backwards compatibility that still allows us to have, you know, kind of the ideal you know, high signal to noise schema. Ernie?
Yeah, I think kind of what this sort of kind of seems like it pushes towards is basically that we had talked about this, like, no bubbling as being kind of like that's sent as part of the operation, as like for this operation, this is the behavior I want. And I think it feels like it's probably worth having some other way to basically like denote your schema as in that mode all the time, right? You said, Benji, like, so some sort of schema directive or something basically that tells whatever the server language is, tells everybody that this is my schema, it defaults to this instead, right? Because I think there are probably enough people who, if they want to, like, I think we should build a feature where it's, if you are starting greenfield, like Steven said, that you can basically opt into this by default and have it be the same way. I don't think it needs to be like we're changing the actual default of GraphQL, but there should be a way to opt into this simply and not have to like force every client, like whether I'm using curl to like send some header or some other like tag in my operation. It should just be like kind of the implied default on the server. Being as it is, I think you have to like people have to opt into it, unfortunately, right? But I think there should just be kind of like we should figure out some sort of like global way to make that like the default state, so that like I can look at somebody's schema, know immediately by seeing some top level query type that it's like, oh yeah, okay, they're opting into true nullable schema here, right? And that kind of like infers what everything else means. And I think it's like that probably requires some investigation of like what does that imply, right? Does that imply that basically? I mean, I would think that implies like everything that's marked as with an exclamation point means will always be present except on error, right? That is kind of like that is what exclamation point means going for that schema, I guess, right?
Yeah, and I think a number of the meta the relay team would actually like agree with you on that. But as you point out, it's not really something that we can do. Like Stephen says, if we look at it from a point of view of what would, imagine we did a major version bump in GraphQL and we had a new version that did breaking changes, what would that look like? That is a good like, Northern Star to guide us on where we're going. But often those things aren't possible. And in general, any existing GraphQL client should be able to query any future GraphQL schema because we're kind of compatible in both directions. So changing a default like that on the schema when the client doesn't even know to ask the question that would give it the answer that tells it that is not really something that we can do. Imagine loading an old graphical against a new schema. It would get unexpected results. Not that graphical particularly cares. It's quite forgiving on what it receives, but relay, for example, would struggle.
Does GraphQL make that guarantee? Like, I mean, it might be nice to, but like GraphQL kind of only cares about the server side of the things, right? So it makes no guarantees about how clients will deal with GraphQL servers, right?
It generally, just like in your schemas, the spec itself aims to always have additive changes. So every existing operation should always have the same meaning. So arguably, if you introduce a new schema, on a different endpoint, then potentially there aren't any existing operations for it. So, you could make that argument. But I don't think that we've actually made any significant change so far, with the exception of like literal bug fixes, like for example, for the default values, that would have broken like the initial version of graphical. I think the initial version of graphical still works against every GraphQL API. It just can't discover the features that it didn't know about when it was written.
I mean, is it possible to introduce like a two like execution mode where like if you don't pass any flag in from the client, then we just run the old mode. But if you pass in the new kind of you flag, then it kind of just runs in the new mode, and then there's kind of like the translator that gives you a schema based on the old execution mode, and then there's if you are running the graphical in the new world, then you get the schema with the new SDL where like the interrobang is a default, something like that.
Yeah, that is actually interestingly one of the things that I was thinking along the lines of when we were at the conference. And that flag is a directive. So I was thinking if you put that directive on the operation and you say like strict mode, or whatever it is you want to call it. We're currently calling it no bubbles, please, but sure, whatever it needs to be. If you had that directive when you did the introspection, then you would be effectively guaranteeing to the schema, I'm always going to include this directive, and it could then answer you a different set of values than if you were to issue the same operation without that directive. It's an interesting idea, but one that I think is challenging. I don't think it's necessarily bad, and I think we could do that. The current proposal doesn't rely on that. Like the introspection is the same for everyone, but what I've added is the ability for you to then toggle on a show me the true nullability setting, which, just like the include deprecated, is off by default or whatever. I forget which way the Boolean goes, but yeah, it should mean that all existing clients will just get stuff that they understand, but the new clients can opt in to receiving this additional information. But we could have done that via a directive on the operation as well. It's just, it wouldn't flow as naturally through the general execution engine. We'd have to add something that explicitly like carries the fact that the operation has this directive through the entire execution algorithm, which we don't currently do. But to be clear, if we want to do the no bubbles, please, then we're going to have to do that anyway. We're going to have to do something that passes it through or sets it as a global or whatever makes sense. So yeah, it's not unreasonable.
I mean, and there would be nothing preventing like somebody on the server to just like auto inject that no bubbles please like automatically for you, right? Like when I was talking about kind of having like that being the default state, it's like, well, you can do that in multiple ways, whether it's an annotation on the schema or it's just like a yep, we always prepend every operation with this thing, right? You get the same end result, I think, right? You're in the same place in both situations.
Yeah, I'd argue that doing that reduces your compatibility and thus effectively means that you're not truly a GraphQL server anymore. But I mean, if that doesn't matter for you and the clients you're using, then that's fine. I mean, you could see it as a network optimization where you just say, clients don't need to send this because we'll insert it for you, in the same way that persisted operations is a network optimization. So you could choose to do that. I'm not sure that we would ever recommend it, but it is an option.
Yeah, just kind of as a like you're not precluding people from like opting into that if that's what they choose, basically. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to achieve this with the the indicator from the client being only for introspection and leaving normal operations alone, which is I guess in your proposal, Benji, I guess that's what we have there, right? It's just like only this include error boundaries kind of it's an argument, it's not a directive, but if we can limit it just to introspection queries, that seems reasonable to just have a new thing that's included in introspection. That's it's not even normally a runtime thing, it's development time thing, unless you like are graphical. And then if we can kind of let that be the mode switch, then it seems like it seems like this should be possible to have this, so that so for introspection, it is it's exposing this true nullability, and there is kind of a there's a separation between the SDL and then the way that's interpreted via introspection. And so we can have SDL be kind of the more clean thing, and but then it's just when it comes to introspection where we have to make sure that we're handling the backwards compatibility.
Yeah, we could make it so that if the schema keyword in the SDL had a particular directive on it, then for the rest of the schema, the interrobang becomes nothing and the nothing becomes a question mark. That's a good point. We could definitely do that with regards to representing it in the SDL. And as you say, what is done there doesn't necessarily have to map directly you should always be able to translate from one to the other, but the rules that you use can be flexible. I agree. As regard your other question, just to be clear, yes, we can do it introspection only when it comes to interrobang. No, we can't when it comes to no null bubbling. But I don't think that's what you're asking. So I just wanted to be clear anyway, in case anyone watching was confused.
And yeah, so I guess in our overall solution, can we get away with only introspection time, which I guess would mean not changing the behavior on null bubbling. It's just you would get that not null bubbling by just not using bang, basically.
Exactly. So the interrobang is equivalent to a non-null field. It's just with an extra guarantee, but a client that doesn't know about it wouldn't see that it even existed. It would just see it as a nullable field. So none of its assumptions would be broken. It just has this weird property that it's never null if there isn't an error. But, you know, that doesn't affect that client in any way. So yeah, it's backwards compatible with older clients, but newer ones can get that extra bit of information about this subtle difference.
This feels like it's really close. I wonder if a next step would be a kind of a tweak on the Benji's RFC here that that does what we've kind of described in words here, to make it a little bit more concrete, because it is hard to just like talk about it without concrete.
Can you enumerate the changes for the note taker, and also can the note taker take very careful notes?
Okay.
So what specifically are we talking about here? The changing of the interrobang in the STL?
Here's my take on it. see if this is what others are thinking. So in the STL, we add a question mark, and this has the behavior of a field being expressly nullable, and then some way to indicate that like I'm in the mode where I'm using true nullability in my STL, which makes the question mark a valid piece of punctuation, and also means that anything that does not have a question mark is not supposed to be nullable. Maybe not non-nullable isn't the right word. And then so that would be the SDL part, and then the introspection part would be probably a flag that would indicate that the client is a newer client that's aware of this behavior and gets introspection that exposes the true nullability. And I think that's it. Is that?
I wrote down in the SDL, we had a question mark. This is the behavior of a field being expressly nullable. Anything that does not have a question mark is not supposed to be nullable. And then there's an introspection part where we have a flag that would indicate that a client is aware of this behavior and gets introspection that's aware of this nullability.
And we could probably more strictly define not supposed to be nullable means that if there is no value, there should be an error, or there will be an error in the errors array.
In that mode.
Benji and I are, it's okay.
And then Young Min had a good question in the chat.
What was that?
I was just wondering, so and I'm thinking in the context of smart clients. So it looks like So with an interrobang, it's only nullable if there's an error. But then is that when you type gen on that field with an interrobang, I guess it's not clear whether we'll have it or not. Is it a nullable field or a non-nullable field? And I guess that, and then do we want to specify that behavior for smart clients or not?
I have a quick
Yeah,
question,
this
just
is-
a point of
Sorry.
clarification. When we talk about the question mark, is that the interrobang? Or is that different?
No, effectively what Stephen is saying, and what I generally agree with, is that the question mark is the left hand, what is currently nullable. What is currently nullable in the spec.
Got it.
Bang stays what bang is already, and what I've proposed as interrobang becomes no symbol.
Yeah. Okay.
And then for cogen, I think that probably what a client would want to do is the user facing types would be non-null in the normal interrobang default case, but this wouldn't be the types that are directly serialized to, so that you don't crash when you're serializing a null. Or I mean, depending on how you're serializing, that the client would be able to kind of gracefully handle when something is null.
So
I guess
to put my spin on this, a hyper intelligent client, if you like, of which I'm currently only aware of Relay, would make it non-null because it knows what it's going to do with that. For example, it's going to throw an error there and catch it an error boundary, which is going to be a fragment or something like that. But for any client that doesn't have that subtlety, which I think is every other GraphQL client right now, I'm not entirely sure that that's true, but I think so. Then I think for them it would be nullable. Effectively, they are not making use of this extra information. And for them, quite possibly, they don't even need this new enhanced SDL. This new enhanced SDL is primarily there for if your client knows how to handle the errors in the specific locations and knows how to express that to its consuming components, if you will, then it gets this extra power, if you will.
for
Isn't
the
it-
Apollo people, do you have thoughts on how you would handle that in your clients?
I think what Steven said makes sense. Like the default would be non-nullable, and probably like throwing if you get a null, and you should also get an error in that case, probably throwing at that point. But that's a big change from what we're currently doing, but it may make sense.
So an error on an interrobanged field would the response would be unusable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, maybe there's a way for it to be unusable, like locally, like not for the whole response, but that's to be defined.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way Jordan always described it when he was discussing it is that like the response is type safe if you include the error information on top of that, right? Like if you take like the response data you got plus whatever fields are marked as errors that tweak the type safety of those fields effectively, right? That is where you get your like type safe result. But I think you sort of have to keep making these like interrobang fields nullable like in the type or like in whatever types you generate, right? Because that basically like keeps the same behavior it does today, but it still gives you the benefit of like looking at the schema and knowing what the true like the data should be, right? You still get the like developer benefit of being able to understand the schema and understand like what we hope to happen versus like what might actually happen in reality.
Yeah, it really depends on what your client is. If your client is fetch, window.fetch, then it's going to be nullable because there could be a null there. If your client is like a new advanced form of relay, then it might be that field's type is actually like string or error, in which case you are responsible for checking to see, is it an instance of error or something like that. Or it might be that it's just string because relay knows that it's going to throw in that position and catch it at the fragment boundary or at a react error boundary. And there's nothing stopping like Apollo client or Urkel or any of the other clients from doing that same behavior. It's just at the moment, errors are kind of like, when they happen, we kind of go, oh, what do we do? Do we just try and use the partial data, in which case nullable? Or do we throw up? Blow up, I meant, rather than throw up. Oops. Then in which case it is non-nullable, because whenever that error happens, we're just going to throw out the whole response. So there'll never be a null there. So it's very much the code gen answer is dependent on what client you're using and how it's configured. But the point is that GraphQL is giving, or this RFC to GraphQL gives your client more options on how to express that. So I would like to think that we will move towards the non-nullable here, but it needs to be done by the client in a safe way.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting follow-up, say, when this this becomes a late stage RFC. That would be a good time for exploration in clients to just kind of prove our assumptions that this is useful and something that can be handled for a spectrum of clients.
Stephen, what did you mean by option for codegen? Is it adhering to a non-null field, or
Yeah,
no?
well, basically in your codegen, you could have this be the interrobang fields could just be nullable, and you leave it at that. And then it's just there's information in the schema that can be helpful to the developer, but basically you're not doing anything in your codegen. Or you might want kind of a strict mode or whatever you call it that throws, maybe I don't know, maybe for like a GraphQL codegen tool, for different use cases, a client developer might want the choice there. I don't know. You're not sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, we're coming up on time now. We've got 2 minutes left. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to discuss, or any points to be raised, or action items to be filed?
What are we bringing to the next working group meeting?
I guess the original plan was to just discuss the stripped down version of the CCN, but then I guess I'm convinced from like this conversation that I think we can replicate the similar behavior on the client side, like even if we didn't have like the bang as part of the syntax, and like, or whether through like individual toolings like support like different type generation like methods like using directives, or just like just handling it on the client side. It's not as nice, but it's still possible. So I think it's okay to kind of put it on ice and to see where this true nullability conversations will go. At least that's my take.
Yeah, so I don't know that we might not have a concrete like proposal or decision for the working group, but it'd be good at least to just kind of update on like this is the direction we're going and get more feedback. Just a time to kind of get feedback there.
Does anyone feel strongly that this is the wrong direction?
Nah. Yeah, no, I think this is the move. Benji, do you and maybe Jordan want to take care of that presentation in the next thing, since you kind of both individually came with the two parts of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reach out to Jordan and I'll so shall I replace the current I think we've already got an item in the agenda, so shall I just replace that? Is that cool?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's fine. And if we get there and everyone hates this, then we can fall back to our old CCN plans.
Absolutely. All right, thank you,
Steven's been a
everyone.
great catalyst for like this conversation, so it's all been worth it.
Yeah, totally.
100%.
It's all an
all
important
it
part of the
took
journey.
all it took was getting us all in the same room together, or most of us anyway. And Stephen's amazing presentation as well. Again, go watch it.
And Ernie.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thank you. Take care.